I've covered politics for many years now. I've watched leaders rise and fall, win decisively and fail spectacularly. I've seen power exercised responsibly, and I've seen it mishandled. But every so often, something happens that makes you stop. Not because it's noisy or theatrical, but because it's quietly unsettling. And those moments, in my experience, are often the ones that matter most. On 23rd February 2026, the President of the United States logged on to Truth Social and publicly described the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest judicial authority in the country, the constitutional backstop of American democracy, as incompetent. He went further, announcing he would refer to the court using lowercase letters as a deliberate mark of disrespect. Most people barely noticed. It passed as just another social media post, another weekday provocation, but it was not routine. When a sitting president seeks to undermine the dignity of a co-equal branch of government, not in private conversation, not as an aside, but in a written statement broadcast to millions, that is not trivial. It is a signal. It tells the public that the judiciary no longer deserves respect. What many missed was that the insult was only the beginning. The president claimed that a ruling which went against him had in fact granted him greater powers than before. He said, using his own words, that he could now do absolutely terrible things to foreign countries. And before the Supreme Court had even heard oral arguments in a forthcoming birthright citizenship case, he declared that the court would get that decision wrong as well. Every leader disagrees with courts at some point. That is entirely normal. I've yet to encounter a head of government who hasn't felt frustration when judges stand in the way of their agenda. But there is a fundamental distinction between criticizing a judgment and attempting to delegitimize the institution itself. One is part of democratic life. The other places democracy under strain. And that distinction matters. To understand why this moment is so consequential, we need to step back. This did not begin with a single post on a Monday morning. It began earlier with a conscious decision to bypass Congress. The United States Constitution is unambiguous on this point. Article 1, Section 8 assigns the power to levy tariffs and regulate international commerce to Congress, not the executive. The framers placed that authority there deliberately, understanding that the power to tax must remain close to the electorate, exercised by representatives accountable to the public. Yet last year, President Trump chose a different route. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, legislation passed in 1977 to address genuine national emergencies such as sanctions and asset freezes. It was never designed as a vehicle for broad trade policy. In fact, no previous president had ever used it to impose sweeping tariffs on global imports. Trade policy is complex and consequential. It affects supply chains, employment, prices, and diplomatic relationships. It demands scrutiny and debate, the very processes that legislatures exist to provide. When the matter reached the Supreme Court in the case of Learning Resources Inquiries versus Trump, the legal question was straightforward. Did the statute actually grant the president unilateral authority to impose tariffs? On 20th February 2026, the court answered that question decisively. By a 6-3 majority, it ruled that it did not. Chief Justice Roberts authored the opinion. Crucially, this was not a predictable ideological split. 3 conservative justices, Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett, joined with Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson. The ruling made clear that the law contained no reference to tariffs and that no president had ever interpreted it in this way before. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of the matter, a constitutional boundary clarified by a broad, cross-ideological majority. But within hours, the administration responded by issuing a new executive order. A 10% global tariff was imposed under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, then raised to 15% the following day. It was against this backdrop that the president's post on 23rd February appeared. And it is worth examining it closely, not through commentary or paraphrase, but through the language he chose. He began by referring to the Supreme Court in lowercase letters, explicitly stating that this was intentional, a reflection of his complete lack of respect. That may sound petty, some may even find it amusing, but when the head of the executive branch deliberately strips symbolic legitimacy from the judiciary, that is not a typographical quirk. it is a political statement. He went on to describe the ruling as ridiculous, dumb, and internationally divisive. Then came the more revealing claim that the court had, in his view, accidentally granted him far greater authority. He suggested he could use licensing mechanisms to carry out, again in his words, absolutely terrible things to foreign countries. He labeled the court incompetent, accused it of serving the wrong people, and then singled out what he called the Great Three, the dissenting justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito, effectively dividing the bench into those he deemed loyal and those he did not. Finally, he turned to the birthright citizenship case. Oral arguments were not even scheduled until April, yet he told the public that the court would find a way to reach the wrong conclusion, one that would benefit China and other nations. This was not a television pundit speculating. It was not an anonymous online voice. It was the President of the United States publicly attacking the judiciary, prejudging a live case, and instructing the public on which judges were trustworthy and which were not. That, quite plainly, changes the political weather. There is an uncomfortable truth that every experienced observer of politics understands. Every leader, without exception, eventually encounters a moment when the highest court delivers a judgment they do not want to hear. That is not an anomaly. It is the system functioning as designed. I include myself in that assessment. During my own time in office, there were rulings that frustrated me profoundly, decisions I believed were wrong in substance, ill-timed, or damaging in their consequences. But there is an unwritten rule that every Democratic leader understands, or should. You do not attack the institution because you lost the argument. You return to your desk. You look for lawful alternatives. You work through Parliament. You make your case to the public. That is the job. When a court rules against a government, there are two paths available. One is to demonstrate that the system works, that no individual, however powerful, stands above the law. The other is to persuade the public that the system itself is broken because it failed to deliver the outcome the leader wanted. Those choices lead to very different political cultures and ultimately very different countries. On 23 February, President Trump chose the second path. He did not simply challenge the judgment. He branded the court incompetent. He publicly categorized its members as loyal or disloyal. He told his supporters that 6 justices, including 3 appointed by conservative administrations, had betrayed the country. And he preemptively discredited a ruling that has not yet been heard, instructing the public in advance that the court would reach the wrong conclusion on birthright citizenship. From experience, I can say this with clarity. When a head of government publicly divides judges into good and bad, this is not commentary. It is pressure. Every justice on that bench is acutely aware that millions of people read those words. The implication is unmistakable. Rule in line with the president, and you are praised. Rule against him, and you are publicly shamed. That is not leadership. And it is not how democratic systems endure. To understand the deeper significance of this moment, we need to look beyond a single social media post or a moment of irritation. What we are witnessing is a broader shift. What happens when the executive branch begins to frame the judiciary itself as an adversary? History offers clear lessons here. Franklin Roosevelt, widely regarded as one of the most consequential American presidents, attempted to expand the Supreme Court in 1937 after it struck down key elements of the New Deal. He had just secured re-election by a landslide. Yet even with that mandate, his own party refused to go along with court packing. Democratic senators understood that reshaping the judiciary to suit the executive, however tempting, would cause lasting damage. They chose institutional integrity over political expediency. During Watergate, Richard Nixon explored the idea of defying the courts. His advisors warned him against it. He complied with judicial orders, and the system held. I went through my own difficult period, facing investigations, adverse rulings, and intense political pressure. There were moments when I questioned the fairness of the process, but I never stood before the public and declared the courts illegitimate, because I understood something fundamental. The moment a leader does that, they are not merely disputing a decision. They are undermining the very institution that stands between constitutional order and the raw exercise of power. What we are seeing now is different in scale and intent. This was not a sharp critique of a ruling. It was a deliberate effort to label judges as loyalists or traitors. It was a public assault on the credibility of the institution itself. And perhaps most concerning of all, it was an attempt to discredit a future ruling before it exists. That is not disagreement. It is delegitimization by design. Democratic erosion rarely arrives in dramatic fashion. It does not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It happens incrementally, one norm weakened, one convention ignored, one institution chipped away at, until eventually the safeguards are no longer there. And this is where it becomes important to be honest. I have spent my adult life in politics. I know the difference between a tantrum and a strategy. What happened on 23rd February was not chaos. It was calculated. The first step was narrative control. A clear legal defeat was reframed as a hidden victory. Supporters were told that the court had inadvertently strengthened the president's hand. The message was simple. Even when the system says he lost, he is still winning. The second step was deflection. Responsibility was shifted away from the executive and onto the judiciary. The debate ceased to be about whether authority had been overreached and became instead a question of whether the court itself was competent. The third step was division. By publicly separating justices into allies and opponents, a loyalty framework was created, one that applies pressure not just to this case, but to every case that follows. And the fourth step was preemptive delegitimization. The birthright citizenship ruling was undermined before a single argument has been heard. Whatever decision emerges in April, a significant portion of the public has already been told that it cannot be trusted. This is not improvisation. It is a strategy designed to control perception, manage dissent, and weaken institutional resistance. The policy response that followed reinforces the sense that this was not an administration caught off guard. Within hours of losing at the Supreme Court, the White House pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. A 10% tariff was imposed almost immediately, then increased to 15% within a day. Officials signaled that licensing systems and further mechanisms could follow. That is not the behavior of a government scrambling for options. It is the hallmark of contingency planning. The legal defeat had been anticipated and an alternative route prepared in advance. What concerns me as someone who believes deeply in constitutional governance is the precedent this creates. By persuading a significant portion of the public that the judiciary is incompetent, politically motivated, or fundamentally untrustworthy, save for a select few acceptable judges, you create a permission structure for ignoring judicial authority altogether. Once the idea of defiance becomes plausible, restoring respect for the rule of law becomes exceedingly difficult. There is also a very real economic cost. Markets dislike uncertainty, and uncertainty is now embedded in American trade policy. Businesses do not know which tariff rate will apply from one week to the next. Importers are facing unresolved questions about more than $130 billion in potential refunds. Consumers are paying higher prices. And all of this has occurred without a single vote in Congress, without hearings, without the scrutiny that democratic decision-making requires. This is not governance by design, it is governance by improvisation. So where does this leave the United States? I would be dishonest if I claimed certainty. Politics rarely offers that, but experience does reveal patterns, and several paths are now clearly visible. The first is the path of institutional repair. Congress could reassert itself. The Constitution placed control of tariffs with the legislature for a reason. If the Supreme Court has now ruled that emergency powers cannot be used to set trade policy, lawmakers have both an opportunity and a responsibility to legislate clearly, defining boundaries, restoring oversight, and reclaiming the authority the framers intended. This is not a partisan issue. There are members of both parties who believe in parliamentary prerogative. The question is whether they are prepared to act. The second path is the one already unfolding. The executive continues to search for alternative statutory authorities. Section 122, Section 301 emergency declarations, each designed to bypass Congress. Each move triggers fresh litigation. Each court challenge brings further uncertainty. Businesses struggle to plan. Allies question the reliability of American commitments. And the constitutional issue remains unresolved, simply migrating from one statute to another. The third path, and the one that raises the most immediate concern, centers on the birthright citizenship case. Oral arguments are scheduled for 1st April. The president has already told the public the court will get it wrong. Based on more than a century of precedent under the 14th Amendment, a ruling against the administration would not be surprising. But if that happens, the ground has already been prepared for a legitimacy crisis. Supporters will have been primed to believe the decision was corrupt before a word was spoken in court. Equally troubling is the alternative outcome. If the court rules in the president's favor, the prior attacks will have functioned as effective intimidation. Either way, institutional trust suffers. The fourth and most dangerous path is a longer-term one. Continued confrontation between the executive and judiciary becomes the norm. Every ruling is treated as a political battle. Every justice is viewed through the lens of loyalty or betrayal. Over time, the country drifts toward a constitutional standoff unlike anything seen since the 1930s, only this time without the shared commitment to institutions that ultimately stabilized that earlier crisis. I cannot predict which route will be taken, but I am certain of this. Responsibility now rests squarely with Congress, and by extension, with the electorate. Allow me to end on a personal note. I have spent most of my life in public service. I have made mistakes, some of them very visible. I have known moments of pride and moments of regret, but through all of it, one principle never wavered: the belief that democratic societies are governed by law, not by the will of any single individual, not by me, not by any president. This is not about vilifying one man. It is about something far larger. The question we now face is whether citizens still believe in the basic architecture of democracy itself. Do we accept that no one is above the law? Do we believe that institutions exist to restrain power, even when that restraint is inconvenient or politically costly? Do we still understand disagreement within the system as a strength, not a flaw? In my experience, the most dangerous moments in a democracy are not when things go wrong, because things always go wrong, but when leaders and citizens alike decide the rules no longer apply to them. That is when the fabric begins to tear. What happened on 23rd February 2026 was such a tear, perhaps a small one, perhaps one that can still be repaired, but only if enough people recognize it for what it is and are willing to say calmly and firmly that it is unacceptable, regardless of party, regardless of personality. So the responsibility falls to all of us. Stay informed rather than inflamed. Vote out of responsibility, not fear. Hold leaders to account, including and especially those you support. Democracy does not sustain itself. It survives because ordinary people choose every day to defend it. I still believe that is possible, not out of naivety. Experience has cured me of that, but because history shows it can be done. Countries recover, institutions can be strengthened, courses can be corrected, even after deep division. The question is whether there is still the collective will to do so.